All right, everyone, welcome to the Public Podcast. I'm your host, JD Durkin. Of course, the Public Podcast brings you in-depth interviews with leaders in business, finance, as well as technology. Hear from executives, analysts, and other experts as they break down all of the top market headlines, dive into strategies of public companies, and uncover tech trends. Be sure to tap the subscribe button to stay up to date with all the latest conversations. And as always, as a reminder, this content is not investment advice, and you are always encouraged to do your own research. Today we are speaking with Natalie Brunell, and Natalie is host of the Coin Stories podcast and Hard Money Show. Natalie is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and one of the leading voices in the Bitcoin community. We're going to be talking all about how Bitcoin could potentially fill cracks in the current financial system, whether Bitcoin is immune to regulatory pressures, and what will drive the next bull market. Natalie, thanks a lot for taking the time to be here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So just first as a quick intro, if I could, I'm really curious what influenced you to pivot from a more traditional career in journalism to instead focusing all of your attention on Bitcoin. What did that decision look like for you?
Sure. So I was a journalist for about 10 years at various markets across the country. I covered local as well as national news. And I feel like I got a really good sense of some of the problems that are facing American communities today. And I also felt like I was sort of the product of the American dream on the decline. My family immigrated here from Eastern Europe. My parents grew up under communism, and they came here, worked really, really hard. And just as they were finally able to afford their first home and sort of achieve the middle-class American dream, they were victims of the great financial crisis and went under. And that's right when I was graduating college. So I graduated into a recession with my family going bankrupt, and I never really understood why that happened or how. What I did know is that, the big banks and the big corporations got bailouts, and the taxpayer essentially had to foot the bill for the mistakes and the policies that were made that caused the bubble, the housing bubble. But I really didn't understand how the financial system worked because unfortunately, I feel our financial literacy education in this country is really, really poor. And so I went off and became a reporter, and I really covered everything that communities were struggling with, from the rising cost of living to increasing crime to public corruption. And I noticed us getting more and more polarized, especially, in the last couple of years. Everyone's kind of dividing into teams. It's this person's fault. It's that person's fault. It's gotten so political. And then I randomly heard about Bitcoin back in 2017. And I became very curious because one of my mentors gave me a book that was essentially about the history of money. It was called The Bitcoin Standard, but you don't really even learn about Bitcoin until the very end. You actually learn all about our current financial system and the history of it. And it was kind of like a veil was pulled out from over my eyes. And I thought, wow, how did I not realize that this is how the system works? And this is why we have so much wealth disparity. And this is why the middle class is dying and the rich are getting so much richer. And so for me, I really went on the hunt for knowledge about Bitcoin at that point because I saw it as a potential solution to these economic problems. And so now I focus my work all on that.
What do you see as being some of the most glaring inefficiencies or the problems, Natalie, that we're facing in the overall macro environment? And how do you think that Bitcoin can allow people to kind of opt out of that system? Do you see Bitcoin as a bit of an alternative for people to focus on?
I do. I see it as a parallel alternative system that people can opt out peacefully and start to accumulate wealth in a decentralized, scarce financial asset. I think it's the fastest growing technology network that I think rivals the internet in terms of its adoption rate. And I do see it as the future of money. And the biggest problem, I think, is actually inflation. Right now we cover it in the headlines because of the post-pandemic stimulus and the monetary invention that we saw that was sort of unprecedented. But the truth is that inflation has been something that Americans have been facing for decades because of easy monetary and fiscal policies. And that has led to a lot of wealth disparity, in my opinion. And so, we have sort of a mandate of 2% inflation being a target by our central bankers, But if you look at the cost of living, if you look at things like the appreciation in real estate, in stock prices, in the cost of education, you see that inflation is actually much higher than the quote unquote 2% our CPI tells us it is. And that's what Americans are really struggling with. Every year they're making about the same in terms of their wages, but the cost of everything is going up around them. And especially for young people who are graduating, who are trying to sort of catch up and acquire assets, they feel left behind. So it's really no surprise that, this new financial ecosystem is developed, this crypto space, and people feel like maybe this is my chance. Maybe this is my ability to finally have a seat at the table. And so Bitcoin, I think, presents the opportunity to accumulate wealth in a way that can never be confiscated, can never be manipulated, can never be inflated by a central bank or a government or a third party. And I think that there's so much power in that. But first, you have to kind of make people understand the problems in the current financial system, because I think for a lot of people, they just sort of, blame it on politics as opposed to actually problems with the money.
And to that point about problems with the current system, I think your own family's personal testimony of the '08 financial crisis and other challenges there is really well taken. And of course, in terms of today's environment, you got the national debt conversation, inflation, which you mentioned. And I wonder how you see Bitcoin having a moment now, especially in the wake of maybe a lot of people out there who have been following the story for several years and are kind of critical of it. But how do you view it in terms of its placement as maybe a bit of a contrast to a lot of these other really challenging economic headlines, Natalie, that we see every day in business news?
Well, Bitcoin is facing a lot of macroeconomic headwinds because it has been correlated to risk on assets and the tech stocks. But I believe that that's largely because it's so misunderstood, and it is a very young network. It has about 2% global penetration right now in terms of adoption, but it's growing very quickly. And I really think of it as similar to when the internet was emerging in the 1990s, and we eventually had that tech bubble, and we saw .coms forming from every corner, and that didn't have anything really to do with the potential and the power of the internet itself and what it was going to do in terms of revolutionizing our way of communicating and our way of doing business. But there were a lot of .com companies that failed. And so that's what I feel happened in sort of the crypto meltdown and the crypto crash. We saw, the tide come out, and we saw who was swimming naked. But Bitcoin is this underlying asset that's sort of the foundation of this new digital economic ecosystem. And I think that it has spoken for itself in terms of its performance over the last 14 years. It's outperformed every stock index. It's outperformed gold. It's outperformed real estate. It's outperformed everything if you were super early. And what people don't realize is we're still very early. A lot of people don't know about it, and they haven't allocated any percentage of their portfolio to it. And yet it is the quickest growing technology network. And once again, it's an asset class that is a form of digital property that no one can ever take from you. No one can confiscate it. No one can manipulate it, and no one will ever expand the supply of it. And in a world of shortages, that's really important. And the last thing I will sort of end with on this note is, if anyone's read the book Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth, he brings up this really compelling and poignant, insight about how when there is abundance in money, there tends to be scarcity in everything else, because people try to stick their money anywhere safe so that they retain their purchasing power. But when you have scarcity in money, you can maybe finally have abundance everywhere else. And we really haven't seen that type of, engine for prosperity since the gold standard. And so for me, Bitcoin represents really the opportunity to have a renaissance of economic prosperity, opportunity, and a renaissance of the American dream, frankly.
What is holding Bitcoin back from being accepted more widely right now, you think?
I think there are several, obstacles. I think a lot of people just don't understand it, so they dismiss it. It's a very, very new asset class. I think government officials aren't very well versed in basic economics, if I'm being honest. And I mean that on both sides, and I don't think that they necessarily have bad intentions. I think a lot of people who run for office or are elected, especially at the local levels, they have very good intentions, but they end up making a lot of the same policy errors. They fix short-term problems by plastering over it with easy money, and it forms longer more difficult consequences down the road, especially for the generations that are to come. I mean, look at how indebted our country is. And the fact that we are $31 trillion in debt right now is just a sign that people don't understand. So if you don't understand why we can't be paying our Visa with our MasterCard until, forever, then you won't understand really Bitcoin. And what I think is critical right now is to really recognize what this means from a global perspective as well, because the US has had this prerogative and this monopoly over the world's money as the global reserve currency. And we're sort of losing our status because, other countries are noticing that if the US can sanction you and the US is going to continue to go into debt, why would we hold treasuries? So we're actually putting our position in peril. And I think people want to hold scarce assets, whether that be precious metals or a commodity-based digital money like Bitcoin. People are looking for sort of an escape hatch because they're no longer trusting the current system because it's too far indebted. So I see Bitcoin as sort of playing a role in that transformation as we move into a digital economy globally.
Natalie, I wonder if any or part of that distrust with the overall system is because a lot of these crypto-related headlines that people see, even for people that have only a loose familiarity with the topic that you and I are discussing right now, they see the FTX collapse. They see all these other companies that are ensnared with that. They see allegations of fraudulent activity or all these storylines of volatility or massive corrections. What keeps you optimistic in the face of all these setbacks and these headlines that as well as I do, a lot of people out there who might otherwise consider getting off the sidelines are seeing that might kind of keep them there?
Yeah. So what gives me optimism is Bitcoin is very different from crypto. And I think as more people understand the space and become educated, then they will recognize that difference. And there will be more avenues for the institutional as well as retail investors to come in a way where they feel comfortable. The crypto space at large is very opaque. A lot of these companies are operating offshore. They print tokens out of thin air that have an infinite supply. And people really don't understand that what makes Bitcoin so unique is that it kind of solves the three problems within the space, which is decentralization. It is completely distributed around the globe. It is scarce. You can never inflate it past 21 million coins. And it's also scalable. It's building on top of the foundation in layers. And so we have the Lightning Network, which is offering fast transactions. You can transfer value from here to another part of the globe in seconds for fractions of a dollar. And so that's really powerful. And when you look at the other tokens and you really start to dig in, you end up sacrificing one of those three prongs. You either sacrifice decentralization for more governance, and it starts to look a little bit more like a digital equity. And a lot of people feel that most of the tokens are digital securities. Or you sacrifice, being able to have a cap on the supply and people just print them out of thin air like SBF did, which is essentially counterfeit money. So I think that if people just come to understand the space and what makes Bitcoin unique in that proof of work consensus mechanism, in its decentralization and its supply cap, then it starts to look very, very special, which it is.
How can we fix any of the trust issues that you think the space has?
I think it will come in time. Obviously, policymakers are trying to come in right now. I think as SBF and FTX are their sort of impetus. But what's disappointing is they're sort of going after low-hanging fruit. It's difficult in a space where, again, a lot of the entities are offshore, and they're going to try to rein it in as much as they can. And I think overall, if we're to step back, I think the best thing would be a clear roadmap and a framework so that these companies actually know how to properly register a digital security versus a digital commodity, and they take the steps to do so with the proper disclosures. Now, in order to operate a security in this country, it's very expensive. You have to hire lawyers and you have to disclose, what is the game plan? Who is the leadership? And so I think that would cause a lot of these token projects to go away. And a lot of people right now are making money on the trading aspect, on the fees, and on essentially, there are market makers, and it prompts questions of, are these companies even trading against themselves? So, it's kind of a wild west. And I think as more clarity develops and as we have hopefully smart policymakers, making decisions that provide a little bit of clarity for investors, then people will understand again, where they want to put their money. And I've always urged people be very careful on the crypto side. I trust Bitcoin. I don't trust a lot of the other entities in this space.
Fair enough. Natalie, is there such a thing as good regulation as it applies to Bitcoin?
Well, I'm just not worried about Bitcoin when it comes to regulation because it's universally recognized as property. And if you pay attention to Gary Gensler, he actually has about a 24-part series on MIT that you can watch on YouTube where he actually explains this whole space, and he explains Bitcoin and proof of work and Satoshi's innovation and why it's essentially a commodity. And so I think, the average person doesn't really think about what is a security. They don't know the Howey test and this 1930s law from think about it, it's from the era of the Great Depression that's informing our securities laws even today. Most people aren't thinking about that. A lot of my peers don't even know what makes a commodity. The fact that, Bitcoin is special because it is no one's liability and it's an asset with no issuer. And so, as far as regulation, I'm always in favor of less government, less red tape, less regulation, because I believe that the best regulator is actually a free market. I think it regulates itself. But I'm not worried about the space when it comes to Bitcoin because the technology really speaks for itself. And we do have the freedom of, speech in the form of code and other protections in place that I think won't make obstacles for Bitcoin for too long.
What is most misunderstood about the Bitcoin conversation?
I just think what's most misunderstood is our current system. I really do. I mean, if people don't appreciate the problem, they're not going to search for or appreciate the solution. And I really speak from experience. I felt like something was wrong. I felt like, why does it seem like the system's sort of rigged? Why are the rich getting so much richer? Why is it harder and harder to afford things? Why am I, graduating from a good university and feeling like, oh my gosh, it's going to take me forever to be able to afford a home in an American, big city? That is what prompts you to sort of go down the rabbit hole. And I mentioned recently on a TV segment that I did, you really have to start to ask yourself if technology is supposed to drive prices down, if it's supposed to make us all, productive and working fewer hours and the cost of a TV went from thousands of dollars so you could buy one for a couple $100s. Why is the cost of living going up? Why is the average home going from $60,000 in 1960 to $450,000 in 2022, whereas the income has not caught up? And so you're working harder and harder essentially for less money, which is why you see this frustration, right? People want the minimum wage to increase and they make it a very political issue. But the truth is, again, you have to look deeper because our policies have come from both political parties, and really they a lot of times start and end with the Federal Reserve and the central bank and this monopoly again that we have over money, where someone could just press a button, unelected bureaucrats can press a button and add to the reserves of banks. And there's a Cantillon effect to that, where once the money printer spigot is open, then the people at the top are closest to it and they benefit from it the most. And the laggards are the people that are at the end of the spectrum, the people who are poor, the people who are on fixed incomes, people on pensions. They are the last in this race when it comes to inflation. And that's not fair. That's not the kind of country that's going to drive us forward and make us competitive globally. It's not going to create prosperity and opportunity for the majority of people. And that's why we are losing the middle class and a sense of, if someone feels like they can't get ahead no matter what they do, what do you think that results in when it comes to society and morals? I mean, people start to feel like they're not in control. And so I think that affects all of their decision making, whether that's, the family structure, their career choices, their, decisions to maybe have outlets, whether it be drugs or alcohol. I mean, people feel frustrated and you see it in the statistics. All of it's going through the roof in terms of our issues. And if there's a solution that's Bitcoin, I urge people to just learn about it, because what is the other side proposing? The people who are anti-Bitcoin, what's their proposed solution? Because what we've been doing as a country has not worked no matter who's been in office.
So let me ask you then about Bitcoin education, because I think you've done a great job over several responses here to highlight the undoubted pressures and challenges that a lot of families like your own have experienced and frustrations with the system. For someone who might be watching the interview and saying, okay, you know what, I'm willing to approach this in good faith. I want to learn. I admit I don't know everything. What do you advise that person? Where should that person start?
So I always point people to the book that helped me start my journey, which is the Bitcoin Standard. And it's funny because I remember my mentor giving it to me, and I'm kicking myself because I put it off for honestly years not reading it, only because I thought, oh, the Bitcoin Standard, that sounds like I'm about to read a book about computer programming or something very techy. Actually, it's the history of money. It starts at the very beginning and how we at one point exchanged beads and shells, and how barter and medium of exchanges emerged in free markets, how we moved on to a gold standard, and from there how we emerged into a fiat standard, how that was once backed by gold, and then through the wars how that changed, in Bretton Woods how we became the US dollar as the global reserve currency. It really opens your eyes and makes you realize that you almost need to unlearn a lot of things to relearn this ecosystem and what it's all about. And that prompted me on a journey where I read nonstop. I have a ton of economics books. Price of Tomorrow, which I mentioned, is phenomenal. It's not about Bitcoin. It's about deflation and technology and how that's changing our world today, and why we need a scarce commodity, money in an economy in order to flourish. And there are so many great books, and I have resources if people want to check out my website. I have literally a page where you can just check out books, podcasts, and YouTube videos that help me go down the rabbit hole. And you can find that at talkingbitcoin.com.
Yes, I do appreciate the phrase "down the rabbit hole," because that's how you know you're really learning. When you really get that feeling of like, man, I've spent so many hours learning this thing, I can answer any question on it. So that point is well taken. I do want to ask you about how we've seen BTC trade recently. We've had a nice little bit of a run up here in the last week or so. What would you see as being central to Bitcoin's next big bull run?
Oh gosh, unfortunately, as we kind of talked about earlier, it is very correlated to the general liquidity in the market. And so when the money printer goes burr, Bitcoin and other risk-on assets take off. And I say risk-on only because it has been correlated, but I actually see Bitcoin as a risk-off asset since I've studied the technology so in depth. So I think that as soon as the Fed is essentially backed into a corner where they cannot continue to hike because essentially the US is moving toward default, since we're really struggling paying those interest payments on our debt obligations with a debt to GDP ratio of over 130%. I think at that point, a lot of people will move their money into both Bitcoin as well as commodities, as well as, maybe the tech stocks once again. But I do think overall we're in sort of a secular shift from those tech and growth stocks to the commodities, to the energy sector, to precious metals, and to Bitcoin. And, Bitcoin's kind of unique in the sense that you're investing in a growing, budding technology network that has a adoption rate that's growing faster than the internet, at the same time as it's a commodity. It's essentially digital gold or digital energy, which makes it really, really unique no matter what, the secular cycle is in terms of investing. And so I think that, whether that takes 6 months, a year, we have the halving coming up in May of 2024. So that's generally a supply shock that's coincided with an increase in the price, but we'll see. I mean, I tend not to look to micro in terms of the movements of the price, because there's going to be a lot of volatility in the short term. When you zoom out, though, it just consistently is going up and up and up. And if you look at the US dollar's purchasing power, it's going in the opposite direction. So I'm very bullish on Bitcoin in the long term, acknowledging that there's going to be a lot of volatility in the short term.
Some big picture context. That note is welcomed here for sure. Do you see the original premise of a peer-to-peer payments network still core to what Bitcoin is, or do you see it evolving ultimately?
I see that as being one of the most important aspects of it. And it's one of the reasons why it's actually adopting in developing nations much faster than anywhere else, including places like Africa, including places like Argentina and Lebanon, where inflation is far worse than our 9% CPI that we've gotten down to about 6%. Overnight, people have had their life savings wiped out by 50%, 90%. People are lighting banks on fire in Lebanon. In real time, people around the world need to subvert oppressive governments. Most people take for granted here in the West that billions of people still live under authoritarian regimes and they don't have financial freedom. There are women who can't open a bank account without their husband's permission. This is a permissionless system network. You can even exchange Bitcoins without a smartphone. You can actually do it via SMS using technology projects like MACROECONOMIC, which is developing very quickly in Africa. That's what makes me really bullish on it as well, because people need the ability to transact in a way that is free of censorship, free of manipulation, and free of government intervention, where someone always takes a cut and tells you what you can spend your money on and whether you can, interact in terms of a global economy. So very, very excited about what's happening with Bitcoin globally. And I hope people take the time to really, learn about the other countries that are out there, because again, we've been so privileged here with the US dollars, the global reserve currency. Meanwhile, we've exported a lot of our inflation and it's hit a lot of countries very, very hard. And so their currencies are failing and they're looking to both the dollar as well as things like Bitcoin for salvation.
All right, Natalie Brunell is host of the Coin Stories podcast and Hard Money Show. Thanks a lot for a great conversation, helping us get smarter together. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.